When we look at the dark history of the world, some names give us goosebumps. These names are remembered not only for the crimes they committed, but also because they reveal the darkest corners of humanity. Pedro Alonso Lopez Monsalve is one of these names. He went down in history as one of the world's scariest serial killers. His nickname was the Beast of the Andes. So, where does this nickname come from? Pedro Lopez is accused of killing hundreds of little girls throughout the Andes Mountains of South America. The number of his victims is estimated to be more than 300. These numbers are not just statistics. Each one represents a family, a life, and a hope. Pedro Lopez. He acted with ruthless skill in choosing his victims. Each of them was part of his twisted and evil plans. In this video, we will discuss in detail the events that turned Pedro into this terrible monster, starting from his childhood traumas. We will share with you the horror experienced by his victims and Pedro's chilling confessions that emerged after his capture. Every detail will hold a mirror to the dark side of humanity. But a word of warning, this story is not for those with a weak stomach. Because the story of Pedro Lopez is filled not only with tragedy, but also with unimaginable evil. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in a small town called Santa Isabel, in the Tolima region of Colombia. Tolima was one of the poorest and most conflict-ridden regions of Colombia at the time. Pedro was born in a country torn by civil war, at that time in Colombia. The violence that broke out between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party left the people in deep poverty and fear. Pedro grew up in such an environment, and this dark atmosphere deeply affected his life. Pedro's family lived in poverty. His father, Medardo Lopez, was murdered just a few months before Pedro was born. Medardo. He died in combat as a member of the Liberal Party during the Colombian Civil War. The death of his father was the first major loss in Pedro's life. However, this loss was only the beginning of the difficulties Pedro would face. Pedro's mother, Benilda, was left alone with her 13 children. She had to work as a prostitute to survive. This situation formed the basis of the abuses and traumas Pedro suffered throughout his childhood. The decisions his mother made to survive turned into deep anger towards her in Pedro's mind. Pedro stated that his mother frequently subjected him to physical punishment and made derogatory remarks. During this period, he was growing up completely deprived of love and affection. Pedro's childhood was filled with the struggle for survival. However, this struggle opened deep wounds in his soul. Another turning point in Pedro's life occurred when he was 8 years old. One day, he was kicked out of the house by his mother. The reason for this incident this was because his mother claimed that she had caught Pedro acting inappropriately towards one of his siblings. Pedro was thrown onto the streets and never got his life back to normal. The first years he spent on the streets were the hardest time for Pedro to survive. Homeless kids like him, begging to survive, they had to make ends meet by petty theft. However, this life witnessed even more terrible events for Pedro. When she was only 10 years old, she was kidnapped by a group of men and sexually abused for days. This incident left its mark as the second major trauma in Pedro's life. It was here that he learned that the streets were a hell as well as a struggle for survival. This traumatic childhood of his laid the foundations for the terrible crimes he committed in the future. Growing up completely devoid of love and trust, Pedro became unable not only to survive but also to control the anger that accumulated within himself. By the time he reached adolescence, Pedro had begun to express his childhood traumas and anger in the criminal world. He first committed small-scale theft to survive. However, these crimes of Pedro were not just a simple effort to survive. His crimes became more complex and dangerous over time. One of the most striking events that happened to Pedro during his youth was his first prison sentence. Pedro was caught during an attempt to steal a car and went to prison at the age of 18. Prison became a turning point for Pedro. This place fully revealed Pedro's dark side. During his first days in prison, she was sexually assaulted repeatedly by other inmates. However, Pedro did not succumb to these attacks for long. One day, he killed one of the prisoners who was harassing him. This murder was the first true expression of Pedro's inner violence. Now Pedro has to fight not just to survive. He also used violence as a tool to defend himself and maintain control. This incident was a harbinger of the terrible crimes that Pedro would commit in the future. Over the years in prison, Pedro became a feared figure among other inmates. Violence was not the only thing Pedro learned during this period. He also developed a knack for manipulating people. When Pedro was released from prison, he was a completely different person. He was no longer an ordinary criminal, but someone who laid the foundations of a dark serial killer. Towards the end of the 1970s, Pedro Lopez went on a journey from Colombia to Peru. This journey marked the beginning of his serial killing career. Pedro was not just a simple swindler or thief at that time. He now had much darker plans in his mind. And these plans would turn into a nightmare that would end the lives of innocent children. Pedro committed his first murders in Peru. Their targets were usually girls from poor families. These children were easy prey in Pedro's eyes. He especially kept his eye on unprotected children playing in markets or at village entrances. Pedro was presenting himself as a trustworthy figure and deceiving the children. Most often, they are given sugar. He was offering toys or food. The children were deceived by Pedro's charismatic appearance and warm attitude and did not hesitate to go with him. The way Pedro approached his victims revealed his intelligence and manipulation skills. He would first surround them with a feeling of security and then take them to a secluded area. At this point, Pedro, he was literally turning into a monster. He strangled his victims to death, but what was really scary was that he harassed them for hours before killing them. For him, this process meant not only physical violence but also the satisfaction of a perverted sense of control. Pedro, he usually left the bodies of the children he killed in mountainous areas or on river banks. These places made finding bodies difficult. However, Pedro had developed a habit after each murder. He would return to the places where the bodies were buried or left and watch the rotting bodies of his victims. It was a kind of triumphal moment for him. In his eyes, he had complete control over the lives of his victims. Although the exact number of children he killed in Peru is unknown. According to Pedro's confessions, the number was at least 50. However, things took an unexpected turn for Pedro in Peru. One day, he was captured by an Amazonian Indian community. While Pedro was trying to kidnap a girl, he was spotted by the locals and stopped when he was about to be lynched in the village square. Pedro's fate changed with the intervention of an American missionary. This missionary rescued Pedro from the hands of the natives and handed him over to the police. However, Pedro, he somehow managed to escape from the Peruvian police and returned to Colombia. This incident did not mean that his murders were over. On the contrary, Pedro was now more dangerous and determined. He began to see himself as a crime machine. These first murders in Peru were only the beginning of the terrible crimes Pedro would later commit. Pedro, when he returned to Colombia, he increased his murders even more and became one of the scariest names in the history of serial killers. In the early 1980s, Pedro Lopez headed to Ecuador. Ecuador was a new hunting ground for Pedro. At that time, it was quite common for children to go missing in towns along the Andes Mountains. Many of these losses were overlooked due to poverty and social disorder. But Pedro's crimes, it would become the main reason behind the losses in these towns. Pedro used the same method in Ecuador. He would trick children into secluded areas and then kill them in a gruesome way. However, in Ecuador, Pedro organized his murders. He was killing at least 2 or 3 children every week. For him, this had become a kind of hunting. Pedro did not choose his victims at random, but observed them in detail. Most of his victims were girls only between the ages of 8 and 12. This age range constituted the definition of perfect victim in Pedro's perverted mind. Pedro's murders did not only involve physical violence. The things he did to his victims represented the darkest sides of humanity. After killing his victims, he arranged them as part of a ritual. He left the bodies in the same position, sometimes strangling them with his own clothes. For Pedro, this process had become a kind of artistic expression. Each sacrifice was a moment of victory for him. However, Pedro started to attract more attention in Ecuador. In particular, the increase in the number of victims alarmed local people and authorities. In 1980, Pedro was caught trying to kidnap a little girl in a marketplace. This capture was the turning point that revealed Pedro's terrible crimes that had been going on for years. Pedro Lopez, after he was caught, he made terrible confessions during police interrogation. At first he denied the murders, but under pressure from the police, Pedro confessed to killing 110 children. He also described the places where he buried the bodies of his victims. Excavations were carried out in the places described by Pedro and many children's bodies were found. Pedro's confessions, he had exposed one of the most horrific crimes in human history. The capture of Pedro Lopez shocked not only Ecuador but the world. His confessions shed light on one of the most horrific crimes in human history. During his police interrogation, Pedro described his murders with surprising calmness. For him, these murders seemed like a normal action, not a perversion or a disease. During his interrogation, Pedro confessed that he killed 110 children. However, later this number rose to 300, including the children he killed in Colombia and Peru. This figure made Pedro go down in history as one of the serial killers who committed the most murders in the world. In some of his confessions, he was almost proud of it when he described how innocent and defenseless the children he killed were. His cold-blooded statements caused even the police officers present during the interrogation to be horrified. Pedro did something that shocked the cops even more. He described the places where he buried the bodies of his victims. Excavations were carried out in various parts of Ecuador and dozens of children's bodies were unearthed from the places described by Pedro. These findings confirmed Pedro's confessions. However, at this point, the following question came to mind. How could he move for so long without being caught? Pedro, he exploited the poverty of the local population when committing his crimes. Children were often not adequately protected due to their families' financial difficulties. Pedro turned these social weaknesses to his advantage. Moreover, police forces and forensic methods at that time were not as advanced as they are today. Pedro's murders were classified as disappearance cases, which were often ignored. This situation allowed Pedro to move freely and increase the number of victims. Pedro Lopez's confessions caused a worldwide sensation. People began to question how such a large-scale atrocity went unnoticed. Media, he called Pedro the Beast of the Andes. His story was notable not only for the gruesome details of his murders, but also for revealing the systemic failings of a society. Pedro Lopez was tried in Ecuador after his capture. However, the trial process was not strong enough to bear the weight of the crimes Pedro committed. At the time, Ecuador's criminal laws allowed a maximum sentence of only 16 years for serial murders. This situation, it diminished the gravity of Pedro's crimes while undermining the sense of justice for the victims' families. Pedro kept his cool during the court process. Despite the pain screams and tears of his victims' families, he showed no signs of remorse. On the contrary, he displayed some sense of superiority in court. In his eyes, this trial, it was a stage for recognition of his own achievements. Throughout the trial, Pedro adopted a sarcastic tone when talking about the children he had killed several times. This caused great anger among the public. Especially the families who lost their children found it unacceptable that Pedro would only receive a 16-year sentence. But unfortunately, Ecuadorian law could not offer more in this regard. Pedro Lopez was sentenced to 16 years in prison in 1983. This punishment was perceived as merely a symbolic punishment compared to the terrible crimes he committed. People thought this was a major failure of the justice system. But Pedro's story did not end there. Because when he was released, things would get even more complicated.